This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling a question that might seem straightforward at first, but trust me, it's full of twists and turns. We're going to explore how Canada ended up joining World War II.
Yeah, it's one of those things in history that seems inevitable in hindsight. But when you actually dig into the context, it was anything but a simple decision.
Right. It's a story of intense internal divisions, global pressures, and some seriously skillful political maneuvering. I mean, imagine trying to lead a nation when half the people feel strongly one way and the other half feel the complete opposite.
Oh, absolutely. And on top of that, you've got the looming threat of Nazi Germany. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a unicycle on a tightrope.
That's a pretty good analogy. So let's start by setting the stage a bit. What was the situation like in Canada leading up to World War II?
Well, you had a pretty stark divide between English Canadians and French Canadians. Many English Canadians felt strong ties to Britain and were eager to support them against Hitler.
Makes sense.
But for French Canadians, another European war was a much more complicated issue.
Right, because of the whole Conscription Crisis during World War I, right?
Exactly. That crisis left deep scars in Quebec. Many French Canadians felt they had been unfairly burdened during the First War.
Forced to fight in a conflict they didn't support.
And those feelings were still very raw. So the idea of jumping into another European war was a really tough sell for many in Quebec.
So basically, Prime Minister Mackenzie King was dealing with this internal pressure cooker from the get-go. But at the same time, things were heating up in Europe.
Yeah.
What was the mood like there?
Well, imagine watching a pot slowly coming to a boil. That's what the 1930s in Europe felt like. Hitler was consolidating power in Germany, and his ambitions were becoming more and more obvious.
It wasn't just talk either. He started annexing territories.
Right. First, the Sudetenland, which was a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia.
Hmm.
And then he just took over all of Czechoslovakia.
Those were pretty clear acts of aggression.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very tense time. Everyone knew that war was probably unavoidable.
So for Mackenzie King, it must have felt like he was being squeezed from both sides. Internal pressure from a divided nation and external pressure from the rising threat of Hitler.
Yeah.
So what did he do?
Well, he had to be very strategic. He knew that staying neutral might not be an option for long, and he needed to secure alliances. But joining Britain too early could have alienated French Canadians and potentially even provoked Hitler.
So he was walking a tightrope, a very, very delicate tightrope.
Yeah, and this is where his relationship with the United States becomes really crucial. Well, King starts working on strengthening ties with the U.S. And there's this key moment in 1938 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt actually visits Canada. And during this visit, Roosevelt publicly pledges his support to Canada.
Whoa.
This was a huge win for King.
So he essentially got this security guarantee from the U.S. without having to formally side with Britain.
Exactly. It was a brilliant move. He strengthened Canada's position without making any premature commitments.
Wow, that's some serious diplomatic maneuvering.
It really was. But remember, the internal tensions within Canada weren't going away.
Right, the English-French-Canadian divide was still a major issue.
And that's where Ernest Lapointe comes into the picture.
He was like King's right-hand man in Quebec, right?
Exactly. Lapointe was absolutely crucial in maintaining Quebec's support. He understood the deep-seated feels about conscription, so he made this public promise that French Canadians would not be forced to fight against their will.
Okay, so this wasn't just some political tactic. This promise was addressing a very real and very painful historical experience. Imagine being forced to fight in a war you don't believe in, a war that's tearing your own nation apart. Lapointe understood that sentiment, and his promise was essential in preventing a complete fracture of Canadian unity.
Absolutely. It was a key factor in keeping the country together, and it bought King some time. But as we all know, things in Europe were about to escalate dramatically.
Because in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland.
And that changed everything.
That was the tipping point.
It was. Britain and France declared war on Germany, and suddenly all eyes were on Canada.
Talk about pressure. So what did King do? Did he finally cave and declare war?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Instead of making the decision himself, King did something unexpected. He put the question of whether to join the war to Parliament.
Wait, so he basically said, okay, Canada, you decide.
Pretty much.
That's a pretty gutsy move, especially considering Canada was still technically under British rule.
It was. It was a brilliant political maneuver. It allowed him to gauge public opinion, make sure everyone felt heard, and subtly assert Canada's growing autonomy on the world stage.
So it was a calculated risk, but it paid off.
It did. It allowed Canada to enter the war on its own terms.
And that decision would have profound consequences for Canada's future, both domestically and internationally.
Absolutely. It's a turning point in Canadian history, one that we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. Stay tuned, everyone.
It really put the spotlight on Parliament. You can almost feel the tension as they debated this monumental decision.
Oh, I bet. You have representatives from all across Canada, each grappling with the weight of this choice, knowing the implications it would have for their constituents, for the future of the country. What a moment in history.
And after days of deliberation, a decision was reached. On September 10th, 1939, Canada officially declared war on Germany.
Wow, so just a week after Britain and France.
It was a decisive move.
And it wasn't just a symbolic gesture either, right? Canada actually played a significant role in the war.
Oh, absolutely. Their contributions were vital to the Allied victory.
In what way?
Well, they fought bravely in key battles, from the Battle of the Atlantic, where they helped protect crucial supply lines, to the D-Day landings at Normandy. Their soldiers earned a reputation for their courage and tenacity.
So this decision to enter the war, it wasn't just about fulfilling obligations to Britain or reacting to global events. It was a defining moment for Canada.
It really was.
It solidified their place on the world stage and showcased their commitment to fighting for freedom and democracy.
And it also had a profound impact on Canada's relationship with both Britain and the United States.
I can see how that would be the case.
Prior to the war, Canada was still very much seen as a dominion of the British Empire.
Right.
But by choosing to enter the war independently, they asserted their sovereignty and demonstrated their willingness to act as an equal partner on the global stage.
So they weren't just blindly following Britain's lead anymore.
No, they were making their own choices, forging their own path.
And what about their relationship with the U.S.? How did that evolve?
Well, Roosevelt's pledge of support back in 1938 had already signaled a shift in the relationship, but the war cemented it. Canada and the U.S. became true allies, working together on multiple fronts, from military strategy to economic cooperation.
So in a way, the war helped Canada step out of the shadow of the British Empire and into a more independent role.
Yes, aligned with the United States.
Fascinating. But we can't forget about those internal tensions we talked about earlier, right? What happened with the whole English-French-Canadian divide during the war?
You're right. That issue didn't just disappear. Lapointe's promise of no conscription was crucial in getting that initial support for the war. But as the conflict dragged on and the need for manpower increased...
Those old anxieties about conscription resurfaced.
Exactly.
That must have been a really difficult time for Canada, trying to fight a war abroad while also dealing with this potential division at home.
It was a delicate balancing act.
So what happened?
Well, ultimately, the government did introduce limited conscription in 1944.
Oh, wow. So even though Lapointe made that promise...
I felt they had no other choice.
I bet that caused a lot of tension.
It did. It led to protests and political upheaval. It reopened old wounds.
It's a reminder that even though Canadians were united in their fight against fascism, they were still grappling with these deep internal divisions, struggling to define what it truly meant to be Canadian.
It's a complex story.
This deep dive is really giving me a whole new perspective on history. It's not just about battles and dates. It's about real people facing incredibly complex choices.
It is, and it's about how those choices shape a nation's identity.
Like in this case, even though Canada faced intense pressure to join the war, there was this strong desire to make their own choice, to assert their independence.
And that says a lot about their character.
It does. It makes me wonder, aside from the political and military aspects, how did World War II impact Canadian society as a whole? Were there any lasting effects?
Absolutely. The war had a significant impact on Canada's social and economic landscape. For one thing, it led to a massive expansion of industry. Factories that had been idle during the Great Depression were retooled to produce weapons, ammunition, and other war materials.
So the war effort actually had a positive impact on their economy in the long run.
It did. It pulled Canada out of the Depression and laid the foundation for future economic growth. But the social impacts were equally profound. Well, the war effort brought Canadians together in ways they hadn't experienced before. People from all walks of life, men and women, English and French, immigrants, and those whose families had been in Canada for generations united behind this common cause.
It must have created this incredible sense of national unity, this shared purpose.
It did. But it's important to remember that this unity wasn't without its challenges. The Conscription Crisis showed that those underlying tensions were still there.
Right.
But even amidst those disagreements, there was a shared commitment to fighting for a better future.
It's so complex, so multifaceted. It really makes you appreciate the sacrifices people made.
Yeah.
And the challenges they overcame.
And it makes you think about how that shared experience shaped Canada's identity on the world stage.
Yeah, it really does make you think about how much the world has changed since then.
It does, and it makes you realize that those changes weren't inevitable. They were the result of choices made by individuals and nations, shaped by the events of the past and their aspirations for the future.
So knowing what we now know about the internal struggles Canada faced, the delicate diplomacy, and the eventual decision to enter the war, what do you think this experience ultimately says about Canada's identity on the world stage?
Well, I think it paints a picture of a nation that's both deeply rooted in its history and determined to shape its own destiny. A nation that values its independence, its commitment to democracy, and its role as a responsible global citizen.
That's a really powerful insight. And it reminds us that history isn't just about the past.
Right.
It's about understanding the forces that have shaped the world we live in today. And using those lessons to navigate the challenges we face now.
Exactly. The story of Canada's entry into World War II isn't just a historical anecdote. It's a reminder that even in the face of global upheaval, nations can choose their path, assert their values, and make a difference in the world.
Well, that's a pretty inspiring thought to end on. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a renewed sense of appreciation for history and how it continues to shape who we are today.
Me too. It's a reminder that the choices we make, both individually and collectively, have the power to shape the future.
Absolutely. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this incredible journey. And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Canada's path to World War II. We hope you learned something new, and maybe even felt a little inspired by the courage and resilience of those who came before us.
And remember, history is a conversation that never truly ends. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into the stories that have shaped our world.
Until next time, keep those brains curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.